England, 1976.
They are punk rockers.
Disillusioned youth.
Raw, outrageous and crude.
Anarchy, striking miners.
The new craze, they tell me.
Mountains of rubbish. The winter of discontent.
Worthless, nasty.
Societal decline, no future, chaos.
They're a hero.
Welcome to Destroy, a podcast about how the punk movement of 1976 spawned a cultural revolution still being felt today.
You have to destroy in order to create.
My guest today is a doctor, a sound inventor, a music maker, as well as a writer and an artist. And in the early 70s, he co-founded the massively influential experimental music group Cabaret Voltaire. Please welcome to the show, Stephen Mallinder. Mal, welcome to the show.
Brilliant. Thank you. You captured that very nicely. I'm very pleased to have been described as that.
Thanks for making the time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. Thanks for having me on.
So you grew up in Sheffield, you lived in London for a little bit, you moved to Perth, and now you're living on the English South Coast. Summarize a little bit for me that journey for you.
Yeah, I suppose the key to it is I never really left Sheffield because my roots were always there, and it's always been a kind of permanent touchstone in my life. So even though I did subsequently move around and based in different places, I've always really been part of Sheffield. I was there 2 weeks ago as well, so it's somewhere I go back to because my family and friends and people who I work with are still deeply rooted there, and I have really strong connections. So I've never really left Sheffield. Originally, I was going to go and study history and politics at the university in Manchester when I left school, but I just started making music at that moment in time and decided not to actually go to Manchester, but to stay. And I did actually work in Steelworks for a year because I didn't actually take my place at Manchester. Eventually, I was persuaded by my fellow workers in rolling mills and lugging stuff around there. You shouldn't be doing this. You're smart. You should go to university. You should do that. You've got the chances we haven't. And they were brilliant people, and I loved them to bits for it. So I did a degree in Sheffield in politics and philosophy and history and stuff, which allowed me to carry on doing music and doing experiments and messing around and just enjoy it. It was just fun. Then we did our first gig, and so we took the name on, and I stayed there, and that was it. The formative years were based in Sheffield, recording there. And the London connection is something that came probably... We'd been making music in various forms for about 10 years, and then we were doing our first album for the Some Bizarre label, and Finance the album. So we recorded the Crackdown album in London. It was the first album outside Sheffield. We used to go backwards and forwards to London quite a bit, and I had strong connections. I'd been signed to the Fetish label. My solo stuff was on the Fetish label. I was friends with people like 23 Skidoo and Throb and Gristle. And so I had a strong connection, a network of friends and everything in London. We kept the studio in Sheffield, but I also had a flat in London, and I commuted between Sheffield and London, and I go up to the studio most weeks, or maybe 2 weeks of every month. I move backwards and forwards between London and Sheffield, and that literally went on for over 10 years. And then Australia was, I think it came a while after we left EMI, so that was early 90s, and we spent a couple of years, Richard and myself, running the Plastics label, self-releasing and doing our own stuff, and I was still commuting between Sheffield and London, but I had 2 children by that time, and it was financially quite difficult, to be quite honest with you. I'm sure yourself and other listeners hearing this will know the pressures trying to keep body and soul together when you have children and the costs of it and everything. And it was quite difficult. We didn't have a deal, and we were living hand to mouth a little bit. I mean, not literally, but figuratively speaking. In that period, it was really difficult for us. And I decided just to give it a break and just do something else. It was also because Richard and I, by this time, had been working together for over 20 years. We've been doing stuff non-stop. We were in contact with each other every day, sorting things out in the studio together, gigging, touring, whatever. I think it felt like it was nice to have a breather. I'd done some solo stuff, so had Richard, And I decided to just go and spend a bit of time in Australia with my 2 young children and my wife, and just go, give it a break because it's hard to survive. I need to think of something else.
You were in Perth, though, which is not the first place I'd think of moving to in Australia.
Much as being an artist and all this, I'm a human being, and we also know when you have children, sometimes it's good to be near family networks, and we did have a family network. My wife, although lived in London, she did have family in Perth in Australia, so we needed a little bit of network support with our children. We decided rather than go to Sheffield, we would spend a bit of time in Australia, and that's where they were.
So you really cleared your head, got your focus maybe somewhere else for a moment, and then continued on?
Yeah, in part, it was also when you've been doing music, when you've been doing stuff for over 25 years, you kind of go, I need to stop and draw breath. What else did I want to do? And I started teaching. I was teaching over there. I started lecturing, but I was always doing music. I was always still connected with music, and I set up a label, Off-World Sounds. I worked really closely with a good friend who is still a great friend, a guy called Peter Carroll, who at that time was one of the people who ran Sony in Australia. So we brought out a good sort of 10, 12 albums and lots of 12 inches. So I was busy doing stuff. I had an off-world production wing of that, and we were putting gigs on, and I was running festivals. Pete and I both ended up running an arts radio station together. I was releasing my own music as well. So it was quite an active period, to be quite honest. And Pete, he's part of a big Manchester collective. He's from the UK originally himself. He travelled the world, and like myself, had washed up in Australia. But he's the cousin of Sean Ryder and the late Paul Ryder, and his brothers are the famous artists who do Central Station, so Matt and Pat Carroll. And it was great because we had a strong connection. We were really active, and we also had this great thing whereby all the artwork for our Off-World Sounds label was done by Matt and Pat, so we had this incredible look for all the releases we brought out, so we had our in-house design team. So I was quite busy doing stuff in Australia, doing my own music and doing all those things.
What drove you to start your own label? And I mean, I get a little bit of from what you said, but I know it wasn't the first time perhaps, but what drove you to do that and put all your time and effort into that?
I think there was a personal thing, which was I like the idea of working with other people. I like the idea of putting something back that was like, as well as being an artist and musician, and I wanted to make music, I was more interested in working very collaboratively. So it gave me an opportunity to work with other people. The label brought out stuff from Europe and America, and it was an idea of using my network and the connections that both Peter and myself had, do something that was more than the sum of its parts. And I think sometimes when you're in a band, you see nothing other than the band. But I quite like the idea of actually doing something that helped other people. I quite enjoyed that, giving other people, particularly people in Australia and local artists in Perth, to give them the opportunity to bring music out, which they hadn't had the chance to do. But also the other thing was at that moment in time, it feels odd now, I think, because the label culture has eroded quite a lot. But if you flip back to 20 years ago, 25 years ago even, label culture was a bigger thing. Obviously, there'd been factory records and everything like that. But also, what was also happening, you were getting labels, say Wall of Sound, for example, or Network, or whatever labels had a certain amount of cachet and kudos, and we wanted to do something that was overarching to not feel restricted to just being a band with just one name. So we were able to do that, and we did brand it, and we did have it in-house designers, and it was lovely because the idea was, as we always had, that the packaging and the design and the overarching look of something was important. It wasn't just purely about what was on the record. The music was vastly important, but it was how it was presented and how people perceived it. So the idea of a label and the idea of a production company that went alongside it suited the philosophy that we were doing. And it was at a time when vinyl was still really strong. That's why we did the label.
You have consistently been an ardent collaborator. You've worked with people helping them, like you just talked about, create their own music. You've worked with so many different bands. You have so many of your own projects and your solo work beyond Cabaret Voltaire, Creepshow, The Cooling Brothers, Wrangler, Wonky Plonky, Electronic. To me, it's, you seem to have this dedication to experimental music, particularly. And I'm curious, what's so important to you about that?
I just think I suppose it's part of my identity, really. And it's also a way of relating to people. And there's a community around it. And I like that idea of communities. Labels being one of them, factory records, industrial records, the TG thing. So the idea of being able to work within communities and spreading across different kind of groupings made sense, and I still do it and make music that way because it's all I know. It's the thing that still resonates.
I know you're talking about collaboration, but you started out experimenting and you're still experimenting, and I'm curious why.
Yeah, I totally understand what you mean, and I think in some ways it's almost like the answer is contained in the question, in the sense that we started off making experiments because we were interested in that. We couldn't replicate or mimic people very well. We had to make something, create it our own way. And so the idea of calling it experimental is just a way of exploring things and juxtaposing things and taking things and putting them in different contexts. That's the experimentation part of it, I think. But I think the other thing is the reason I still do it is because it feels as though that's the continual thread in my life. I don't want to lose that inquiring spirit or that inquiring mind. But also there's another simple answer to that, is that I'm not a particularly great musician. I'm not a particularly great singer, but I love the idea of trying and seeing what happens. And that's what we're all great at that. We can all be really good at that. It doesn't necessarily have to be around proficiency. Just because you can do something doesn't mean makes it great. What makes it interesting and makes it great is it's your personal take on it. And so I think that experimental gene is there, and it connects what I do now with Wrangler, and that's a connective thread all the way through to working in Chris's loft in 1972-73 when we first started. The reason I do it is because it connects me. It's the common narrative throughout everything I do. And so it just makes sense to me. I couldn't just suddenly become a different person. It's just a way of working, really.
I think, to a certain extent, to me, it's, and this is my interpretation, is that questioning of what, you said you're not a good singer, you're not a good musician, but depending on the definition of what is good, I guess what I'm trying to get at is you were driven by the experimentation, but it's really interesting to me that you keep doing that, and there's a connection to even what you're doing now with Brighton and the students. It's never sitting still.
Yeah, I think it stops life being boring, really, doesn't it? And it also allows me a wide scope, and there's a lot of width in there for me to try and do whatever I want, and it still fits in with who I am. And yeah, it's just the pathway that I've always been on, and like I say, it adapts to whatever situation I'm in, whether it's writing, whether it's talking to people, whether I'm in the studio or whatever. And it's the root of art and creativity, but those things are really hard to define. But what the root of it is play and enjoyment and fun and challenges as well, to challenge yourself and other people to push things and see what you're doing. But there is always an element of, I'm not frightened to fail, because I think that's the key to it, perhaps, because my benchmarks are my own, so it doesn't really matter to me.
You mentioned this before, was the packaging, meaning how something is presented, how it's put together. Why is that important? How does that tie with the music, with your approach, your collaboration, etc.? I think you mean it maybe differently to this idea of creating an identity, but is it work on the same level as the music in terms of giving a visual representation of that questioning?
Yeah, I think so. I think, do you know what? It's really weird, but I think and it is subjective. It's purely, like I say, it's like talking about saying, I can't play, I can't sing. All of this is subjective, but I think, and this is the interesting bit, it's always about what feels right in that subjective sense. So it's about something that sounds right to me, and whatever that sound is and whatever that record, it's also important that is presented in a way that looks right as well. So it can reach people on different levels, I think. And this is where there is a sadness to me in some ways about this world now, which is really taken over by streaming, as we've lost the object that's attached to the sound, because sound is ephemeral, it disappears, it's got no materiality. The important thing is, if you do sound, you have to attach materiality and context to it. And that's why the artwork and the visuals and the videos and everything about it and the photographs have to be right, because when you're dealing with something that's ephemeral like sound, that context for it is for me is vitally important. So that's why it's important. I can work with designers that I love and appreciate, and photographers and all that. And so you make it the best you can, because otherwise sound it's really hard now. And it is hard now. It's nice in some ways, in the sense that sound has been reduced to its purest immaterial form being streamed. But I think what is a little bit sad is that we've lost a lot of that kind of context, that visual context that makes the music that people make very interesting and very seductive and challenging, and gives it its kind of visceral nature and its vitality as well. So that's why all those things are really important to me.
I listened to an interview with Malcolm Garrett, designer, and he talked about how he doesn't define himself as an artist, but he says his work is a visual representation of the music. It's similar to what you just said. It's like, what does that music look like? And it's interesting. It's something which I know for myself, it was the packaging. It sometimes was almost more important than the music. And then it all came together between Cocteau Twins, Joy Division, you name the bands, even Simple Minds. Anyway, bring me back to Brighton. Why Brighton?
Brighton, the connection with Brighton it was quite a simple one. I was lecturing and I'd written my PhD, which is called Movement, the Journey of the Beat. So it's about rhythm and the movement of rhythm through analog and digital. So I was doing that, I was finishing it off, and I got invited over to Brighton to do some research, which also allowed Brighton to use some of my research for its ref submission. And my supervisor was wonderful Tara Brabazon. And basically I came over to finish the PhD close by her and to do some research and bits of teaching in Brighton. I was intentionally going to be here for about maybe a year, 18 months. And I've been here ever since, because I started working with and meeting some brilliant people. You know, it's funny, you're talking about 4AD. But I work with Chris Bigg, who's one of the 23 Envelope, along with Vaughan, and I work with him. And I work with a great designer called Paul Burgess, who was here based at the university, an illustrator. I work with amazing people here, and there were some really cool people. So I got sucked in a little bit to that, and I also started making music again because I hooked up with Ben Edwards and Phil Winter, who are my best friends. We do Wrangler and Creepshow together, and I work with Benj. I've just spoken to him a few minutes ago. We've been working together now for 12 years, longer, probably about 15 years. So I just became inculcated into both Brighton and Britain, and, you know, it just became something that's part of my life. It was a nice place to be, so I was less enticed just pull up sticks again and go somewhere else. So I stayed here, and that's why that's brought everything up to date where I am now.
You said you're teaching, but when I was just going through what you've been doing, it seems like you're one of the most prolific people I know, from music to teaching to writing to events to everything. It seems that you just can't stop creating. It's amazing. Tell me about the events that you're doing, because those have emerging musicians, people performing, making films. Is that coming out of what you're doing at Brighton?
suppose there's an arty parameter to what I do, so therefore it does feed into some of those things. But I'm still really very much a musician in that sense. The stuff I do is still based around releasing music.
What's the goal of what you're teaching at Brighton?
The goal is about all the different nature of how sound adapts to every aspect of our environment. So it is about field recordings, it's about multi-channel immersive pieces, it's about how sound works with VR, it's about AI. It's also about people making records that they love, and it's about people performing records that they love. And also our students do AI stuff. We had an amazing final degree project with a student doing a wonderful AI piece. He worked with kind of an AI platform and created and made an album and made a film. So we're not prescriptive. Students can choose their own pathway. Sound is a medium that requires context. So it's about applying context to sound, be it using film, be it using three-dimensional spaces in installation art, be it about doing field recordings and immersive stuff for VR. So we encourage students to find their own context in which they fit sound, and we work with them on their chosen pathway. And I think that's the interesting thing, but I certainly believe that is the future of it, in the sense that it's about understanding how different mediums work in creative subjects. But students don't come in and we teach them how to make an album or make a hit record or whatever. We just get them to play with sound as a medium, as a sculptural thing. It's also about how sound works within the world. Some students will do research into sonic warfare or whatever it might be. So as long as sound is at the centre of what they do, they can do whatever they want. That's it. It's as simple as that. So it's quite experimental in that we allow people to play with stuff. We encourage failure and experimentation as much as we do anything else. So they can freak out a little bit, but they eventually get their heads around it, and they do amazing things. Yeah.
Do you know somebody called Alex McDowell by any chance?
Alex McDowell.
Al McDowell. He was...
Yes. He was rockin' Russian. He won the Oscar for that Spielberg film.
Yes.
Yeah, I know Al really well. Yeah, he worked on some of our videos. Yeah.
Yes. So it's so interesting. I spoke to him. He now teaches at USC, University of Southern California, and he's teaching these programs about, it's almost like futurism. Imagine the world in 300 years from now, and there's been a massive disaster. How would you rebuild that world? And it's just, oh my God, you reminded me of something he said, because he said the students, they just freak out because they have nothing, and you have to just try and reimagine how you reconstruct civilization. The thing that interests me a lot about you and your career is the interconnectedness of it all. And I know that's probably true of a lot of musicians, but how you went from meeting at school, becoming the Cabs, and then everything else that came after that in terms of working with people in New York, etc. That's the premise of this show. I'm fascinated by that longevity of people's career and the impact they had on multiple different generations. But I'm curious, for you, where did that begin?
It began with a passion for and loving music, and I was listening to blues and the Beatles and all those things, Black American music, Jamaican music, early reggae, and soul music. The other catalyst as well was the really early glam rock, very early David Bowie from Bass Oddity and Laughing Gnome. And then the big catalyst, I think, for all of us, and what kind of drew us together as the Cabs, was Roxy Music, and the fact that Roxy really changed the whole idea of what music potentially could do and how you could work with sound, particularly Eno, who obviously was then using tape recorders and synthesizers. And I think that was fascinating because neither Chris, myself, nor Richard were actual musicians, but we were interested in music, and that gave us this sort of light bulb moment where you go, oh, wow, this is really interesting. People making sound, contribute to stuff and doing it within a kind of pop culture framework. but it wasn't actually music as such, so it was just that way of being able to build it. We were never a punk band, but that period was a moment in time that, it was a paradigm shift where there was a generation of people who wanted to be heard for whatever reason, for either political reasons, for their own just to be seen and heard, or whether it was just youthful exuberance. A whole generation came together. So I think that was the embryonic thing. Punk was important in the sense that it opened doors and gave opportunities for you to suddenly slip in through the open door that punk created. And I think, as you say, that then inspired people like ourselves and The Fall, a different type of music, a different sound. Marky Smith, a very different type of person. But I think both the Cabs and The Fall were very influential because we were both opposite ends of the scale or different sides of the coin, but we represented a potential for people who normally wouldn't be able to make music.
Definitely that time opened the door to people to be able to say, I can do this. I don't have to be a trained musician. I don't have to follow, traditional path to being in a band. And I think that was really the impetus that drove me to wanting to make music and then actually get into design as well. The two kind of related. It was like I realized that design became a way for me to express myself, because being a shy kid growing up, it's always hard for me to have a voice, but things like design was my way of getting recognition for what I was saying, even though it wasn't necessarily in words or music.
But it was really important to us, and maybe more so for us, the idea of the design, the look, the sound of something and the look of something and how it was presented was really important. So how it worked for us was how it worked for other people like Tony Wilson, people like Rough Trade, Neville Brody. We were all a bit liberated into doing it our own way because all of a sudden the rule book had been thrown away, so it gave us the opportunity to do it that way.
No, totally. I remember seeing a documentary a while back. It was to do with the birth of electronic music in Northern England. And it was interesting to me that bands like the Sex Pistols and the Clash and so on, it was very much more kind of guitar-driven, more traditional instrumentation. But bands like Clock DVA and yourselves and obviously Human League and OMD, there's so many Northern bands, even Joy Division, there was this kind of electronic facet to what you all were doing, and I'm curious where that maybe came from.
I think the reason for anything is always complex rather than singular. I think some of the elements that were at play there, in a lot of the northern cities, the distractions were probably less. We did tend to make our own entertainment. I think certainly for us, the reason we were in a band, and the Human League and DVA and that kind of followed on, was we had to create our own world because there wasn't as much going on. We weren't London, bands came through and all this kind of stuff, but it didn't have the distractions. I think in northern cities, if you were of that generation, you came through and you made your own function. You didn't really fit in with the more traditional kind of club life and pub life and all that kind of stuff. So if you're a little bit odd and a little bit out on the edge, then you tended to make your own kind of entertainment, and as a result, that's what came in those places. I do think the other part is technology itself. Obviously, the electronic stuff had developed, and particularly certain relevant for the Human League and bands like OMD or Gary Newman or whatever. All of a sudden, there was like cheaper and more available technology that you could use, and it was also reflected that kind of feel that we all had, that we saw ourselves as modern, as modernists, as people looking to the future. Rock and punk very much still had more than one foot in the past in the way it presented itself, but I think there was also that generation and groups of people who wanted to see themselves as part of the machinery of the modern world and the post-world space age kind of thing. There was that fed into it as well. And I think we were perhaps influenced as much by film and television as anything else. It was Tomorrow's World, Doctor Who, Star Trek, and all those kinds of things, which very much explains bands like the Human League and the fetishization almost of technology in those early days. So I think there was like things overlapping, and there was just the zeitgeist really at that moment in time. But technology became the accelerator of those things, and so we absorbed it into what we were doing.
You reminded me of one thing I wanted to ask you about, and I know you work with Neville Brody, correct? Is that right? A while back.
Yeah.
And I read that he came to a gig and he said, I want to do a cover for you. And you said, will you do it for free? And he said, yes.
We were doing a gig in London, and Neville was at London College of Communication, and he was just into the music, and he was like, it was an opportunity. It was like, could he do it? And we were like, great, I've got a designer, which was very rude. Was, in fairness, that relationship, which was built on that initial sort of thing, and it was mainly because we were bringing out an EP, and it was just a one-off EP, and Neville did the brilliant artwork for it, and it was like, oh, wow, this is amazing. And in the end, you know, we did God knows how many album sleeves with Neville.
I mean, he saw it probably as an investment, and he was obviously passionate about what you were doing, and in a similar way, looking to doing things that were a little different to what was going on at that time. But the other thing you mentioned was how technology drove very much the development of the way music evolved. And you made me think of the Roland TR-808 and how that really became a big thing with house music and that genre, and then how you were caught up in that scene too. So that was fascinating to me, how you went from being this sort of industrial music band from Northern England, and all of a sudden you're over in New York working with all these New York DJs, and then being sampled, and then it becomes part of house music. So there wasn't really a question there, but it's very fascinating to me that, and maybe elaborate on that a little bit.
Even though there's not a direct question in there, the relevance of it was, and the sense of continuity for me and how it links, which I think is probably the important bit about that. And really, I think even though we weren't a punk band, we appreciated what was going on at that period with that kind of explosion. But for us, it was also 3-4 years later, we looked at what was happening with electro in New York and in America, and we thought that was just not the same aesthetically or sonically the same, but in terms of energy and in terms of meaning, that was punk to us, in the sense that it was kids from the street fucking around with technology, and they were without rules, and that was what was important to us. We were never really into guitars, so the punk thing was not, it didn't really mean that much to us. We were into more the electronic side. So when you've got people like Arthur Baker, John Roby, and you've got all the electro scene and all that. And it goes back, you know, prior to that, D-Train and Peach Boys and stuff like that, which was happened in the kind of very early 80s after punk. That was really appealing to us, because it was like, wow, this is melding kind of soul music, black music, and technology, and it's people using technology almost without rules. Chris had left by this point, but for Richard and myself, we very much grew up on soul music and American black music as well. It really resonated with us, because it was like, this is what we're interested in. It's what we've into the music, and we got the roots of it. But also, we love the fact it was people like us misusing technology in some respects, which we really loved. All good culture does come from beneath, and that was a culture that was coming from beneath, and the early electro and early hip-hop and all that kind of stuff, that was really appealing to us. So that's why it made sense to us, really.
This might be an overstatement, but do you think that you and what you were doing, maybe in addition to others, were responsible for the birth of techno and then acid house? And there's an interesting full circle to some extent. You have Kanye West, Chicago House, etc. But then you also have Happy Mondays and Factory. But how do you think you played a big role in that, or where do you think your role was?
In some ways, I sometimes think we're the band's band. If people talk about the influence of European electronic music on house and techno, for example, and I think the Detroit guys will talk about, say, Tubeway Army, Gary Newman, or they'll talk about Depeche Mode. May not talk directly about us, but we're quite aware of the people they talk about. We're almost like the source of those things that influence them, because we were doing things a little bit earlier. I think the thing about us with Camps is, I think we were very influential. We had bigger records and we had club chart success and all these things, but we were never successful enough for that to anchor us or chain us to something. So we were always at liberty to go on and do something else, and that was quite nice, because there was never oh, we only like that thing that you did, and now you don't do that. We've all completely forgotten about you. I think we were always able to move on, and people still connected with what we were doing. So we were never famous enough to sort of limit what we were doing. So I think we've always been worked underneath the radar a little bit.
But you haven't sat still. You've continued to evolve even your own musical projects. Like I was listening to some of the side projects, collaborations that you've done, and they're all so different. And to me, it's wonderful to see how, as a musician, as a band, you're not relying on that history. You're still trying to make a mark or try to question what is music, etc. I find that kind of creativity really meaningful to me.
And I think in some ways I'm very lucky in that I enjoy working with people, and there's a collaborative nature to what I do. So I'm lucky that I still get a real buzz and enjoyment out of working with people as well. I mean, a couple of solo albums in the last couple of years, and it's nice to enjoy it. But I always love working with people and doing stuff. So there's a social component to music for me. I've obviously done a lot of mad things and crazy things I don't know over the years in music, but it's very much about that enjoyment from doing it. And I'm lucky. I still work with people who I love working with, whether it's people who run labels, whether it's people I'm in the studio with, whether it's other artists. Obviously, I've been doing quite a few collaboration things with Wrangler and with John Grant as well, doing Creepshow stuff. I enjoy connecting with other artists and with other people, and that's the fun bit. And I do think that's the way the world in which we live is currently a very networked and collaborative. What you should be in. It's more effective and more successful, I think, if you are able to work collaboratively, because people have such great ideas. I have my own take on things, but I'm always interested and fascinated by other people, and that keeps me going as much as my own thing.
Yeah, it seems like you have a real curiosity, and even just talking to you, I can sense that you're still so passionate about the business that you're in, even though you're doing it more from a personal standpoint than anything. But I'm curious, how do you find that momentum? It sounds like from what you said, it's the collaboration that really keeps you going, or is it something else?
Yeah, it is, and it's just the fun of it, and also there's a part of it, and I can't say I can explain it or even understand it, and that is, we all say it to each other. Why do you do stuff? And you go, I don't know. It's just what I do. When you go, yeah, because it's part of who I am. It's my way of expressing stuff. It's my way of connecting. It's my way of understanding. It's my way of translating the madness of the world in which I live. I read a really funny thing. Orson Welles said this, and I thought it was brilliant. He went, don't say you're a professional to me. I like the person who goes, no, I do this because I love it. I do it for love, not for because it's a profession. And I love that idea. I think that's brilliant. It's that idea of, oh, it's a job and it's my profession. It is a job and it is a profession, but you can't have that without having the amateur soul about you and doing things for love and doing things because you get enjoyment out of it, or you get something out of it that you don't even know. I mean, I suppose I am successful and I'm still doing this and I make a living out of it, but not to the extent where I feel as though, oh God, I can't do anything next because the last thing's finished. I can't do anything else after that because that defined me. Nothing particularly defines me. It all defines me, not one single thing.
I wanted to ask you how you define success. And obviously you've achieved a lot, done a lot, been influential a lot, but clearly success it's not about success in that kind of traditional sense. But I'm curious how you maybe define that for yourself.
I think success for me is a sense of satisfaction from what I do. It is a matter of satisfaction, particularly making music and making anything creative and making art is difficult. It's difficult, certainly, to be able to assess it by putting a monetary value or an exchange value on it. It's the added value that you can get from what you do that I find interesting. That's what I get out of it, really. Because chart success or hits on Spotify or all that, I can't get involved in that because then it just becomes a competitive thing and I'm going to lose out in those competitive sweepstakes. So I think the more interesting thing is the qualitative thing and the fact that if someone's life is touched by what you do, then I'm well happy with it.
I mean, it seems like being able to continue to create, collaborate is success in itself, because there are a lot of musicians and bands where it reaches a little bit of a plateau and then they struggle to get back to that place of feeling good about what they're doing. And I don't know for sure because I'm not a musician, but that's a sense I get, at least some people I've worked with.
This is a kind of a weird kind of tangent, but the American gymnast, Simone Biles, she got a lot of shit, but I heard her talking and I just thought, wow, what an incredible woman. And it made me think about success and how difficult it is. She took a step back and stopped doing it. And she was saying, no, I needed to take a breath. Imagine you're 19 years old and you've won a shed load of gold medals and you've done all this stuff, but you're 19 years old and you go, I've got another sort of 60, 70 years to live. How can I actually kind of surpass that?
Right.
And it wasn't, I'm really upset, I'm fucked up because I'm not going to surpass that. It was more a case of, I need to draw breath and take that in, that whatever I do from this point has to have meaning, but it can't be quantifiable by the fact that by 19, I achieved all this major stuff. And I just thought, wow, what an incredible woman. And she's an artist in her own right. What an amazing athlete and everything. But I just thought, what an incredibly mature thing to do, to go, wow, I'm 19 and I've possibly achieved everything that I could ever dream of in my life. But there is that thing of how do you deal with the fact that, have I peaked? What comes after this? And I think it's just that realization that you have to get something out of it yourself that's got nothing to do with quantifiable success in that way.
It's funny you say that, because I'm going through a little bit of an inflection point, because when I came to America, which was about 20 plus years ago, I didn't understand why I was here, what I was doing, and I wasn't happy. And I came to terms with it by saying, you know what, I was maybe 35-ish. And I was like, you know what, I've achieved so much and I should be grateful for that and just recognize that. And then I went on a little bit of a tangent and now find myself today saying, like, I want to get back to that place where I feel like I'm doing something and I want to reinvent a little bit. And it's interesting because to a certain extent, it's like I'm going back to the beginning, which was music, and in terms of the 70s and what was the impetus for me launching my career, or at least going down a path that I enjoyed. So I wanted to ask you a question about the future, because you're obviously working a lot with students and you're collaborating a lot with different musicians. Where do you see, not your future necessarily, but like the future of music making, creativity? Where do you see a future? I know those are two questions, but that's kind of part of it.
It's really difficult at the moment because obviously, like every aspect of life, that technology that 30, 40 years ago, which I was talking about going, we wanted to become it and not just embrace it, but actually become part of that technology thing. I remember John Fox, who started Ultravox. John always said to me, didn't just want to play with machines, I wanted to be a machine. And we loved that technology. But now we've reached a point where that technology is overwhelming us a little bit. And I think it doesn't mean that we aren't creative. I think we've got to adapt to the new tools that are there. And I'm thinking very specifically about AI.
Sure.
But the other part of it is that we also have to adapt to the way that the world is, that monetary stuff is not the way of judging things, because it's completely pulled the rug out from under music. Spotify and everything, I'm not knocking it. I'm not an old man shouting at my fast-moving trains or anything. But we have to acknowledge that the world in creating stuff, bringing things out, people buying it, you could then reinvest that and do stuff. Now it's very difficult because the musicians and artists, not just within the world of sound, it's very difficult because Spotify and streaming and the ubiquitous nature of material and content, and the fact it's not material, it's dematerialized now. We live in a digital world. The material is gone, the content is gone. Everybody can access everything, everybody can do everything. We really have to assess how we do things and how we access things, because I think it's just hard for younger musicians now. I think it's difficult for people to see career stuff with music, but I do think that people want to still do music as a form of expression. but it's just a matter of how people can survive if they want to make music, and I find that really difficult. I do with the generation, and I'm not saying it's all over. I'm just saying it is difficult for people, but I think music's not the only one. I think it's going to be difficult for people, for future generations. How we survive in terms of work and selling things is not going to be the only way that defines us. And I think for people doing music, selling music should not define why and what we make. It's just something that at the moment is being a consideration. We've reached a point of AI, which is fascinating, but I think we're at the very beginnings of artificial intelligence revolution. We've been through the industrial revolution. We've been through the technological revolution. We've been through the digital revolution. But this is a whole new ballgame now, and I'm not quite sure what it means. People will embrace it, but I like to think that we need to find new ways of how we embrace this new technology in that sense, and I'm intrigued by it.
I kept you for a long time. I have one last question, maybe, which was just come back to that time in 1976 when society and music was in turmoil. And I know what you were doing came before that, but I'm curious less about how it furthered your career, but more how it impacted you on a personal level, or what you were doing, if it was inspirational, if it was not. Or
I think what it did do was, I think this is the lesson that is really important for us now, and it's all continued to be, and it goes back again a little bit to that point I made about working today in a creative way requires a level of collaboration, and you need to be an artist that can relate and connect with other people and network and build things up. And I think that's what that period did, I think, for us, because we went from starting stuff in sort of 1973 was when we first started doing things, right, and spending 3 years just working away, and you're just three of us, me, Richard and Chris, working away in the loft and spending a couple of nights a week just making weird electronic music and sounds and stuff that we'd no idea what was going to happen with it, but we just wanted to make it. And almost like feeling like the most isolated kind of people in the world. It was like we don't know anyone who's doing anything like we're doing. We've spent years doing that. And then all of a sudden, people popped up. Throbbing Gristle popped up. Certain people just suddenly popped up. And then by the time that, 76, 77, the punk thing happened, all of a sudden these people had just popped out of their kind of bunkers. And we realised that there was a whole connection, everybody from people like yourself, people who wanted to do things, even if they weren't making music, they wanted to be involved, be it promoting, doing designs, running labels, doing fanzines. All of a sudden you realise there's a whole kind of culture there and a whole community. And I think that was the thing that I got from that, which I still retain. And it was through that period in Australia when I ran the record label. And it was that thing of being able to connect with people and seeing similarities and like-minded people, and having that, being encouraged and being empowered by not the strength of numbers, but that connection to people and that sense of community and that sense of other people. There's interesting people who get what you're talking about. And again, it links back a little bit to that thing of what do I get out of it? It's not about record sales, because I don't get those. But if I do get individuals can say to me that meant something to me, and if I can say that to someone else, that was the thing that came out of that period in 76, and that continues to connect me to things and keep me going and inspires me and makes me want to do stuff. And that period, 50 years ago, taught me that, and I'm still living that, I think, to some extent. And that's why working with kids and students is the same thing. You find connections, music and sound giving you the capacity to connect with people and with things as well. I think that's what I get from it. That's amazing. I'm not going to keep you any longer because you've spoken for a good while. Oh, no, it's been great. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Yeah. I'm very grateful that you told me to record this. The other thing is that for the last 2 years, I'm supposed to be writing the book, which I actually got a title for, and I'm working with a designer, but I keep doing bits of it and pushing it to the side because I'm just busy and I'm doing stuff and I keep going out. Eventually I'm going to stop teaching to the extent I do, and I will write the book. But And I like talking to people, and I keep thinking actually talking to you is helping my research as well.
It's funny you mentioned writing a book. This podcast came from wanting to do a book. I found it so hard to write a book because it's not a complicated subject, but there are so many tentacles to it. And I made some progress and then basically had to stall it because I just ran into a dead end. Like you're saying, it's almost easier to talk about it than write it.
You know what? And I've decided I'm going to do it with AI, and my plan was to just talk and put all this in audio and then get AI to just construct it in some things. Go, once it's written down, it might make more sense, because actually, even though I do write and I've written loads of PhD, sitting down at the computer, sitting down at the laptop, I just go to write. I just go, oh, no, I can't. I've written loads, but I can't finish it. So I'm actually thinking of actually using AI so I can just talk.
It can be your editor, basically.
Yeah. And this is what's interesting. That's why I'm saying I don't shut down the idea of AI. I'm equally enthralled and terrified by it like everyone else. But I think I've got friends who do really interesting creative things with it. And like I say, I'm not anti-technology. It is quite fearful at times, but yeah.
There was a time where it felt like the world was going to come to an end, which I've heard so many times. I'm sure you have as well, with emerging technologies and different sort of this, that, and the other. But it's embracing change is really what it comes down to, and being willing to be open-minded and be receptive to the potential versus saying, I can't ever work again, or it's going to take away this, that, and the other. It's the opposite. In many ways, it opens the door to possibility versus closes it.
I also think that it's not a danger, but I think sometimes we need to just stand back and look at the bigger picture of it much more, in the sense that we all quite rightly related to our own kind of experience and our own worlds and go, how's it going to impact me? But I think we need to pull back and just go, hang on, this is going to accelerate society massively, and in a way that it is going to cure cancer. It is going to change so many things, because it can do tasks and things that would take researchers and scientists decades to do. It can do in a massive short space of time. So I'm fascinated by those things. It is going to rapidly change things. But at the same time, there's loads of shit goes on where there's still massive inequalities, there's massive poverty. I'd love to think that we could pose those questions and it can help us solve some of those things. But at the moment, we're just going to have to live with Elon Musk's version of it.
Right. It's great. It's been thrilling to talk to you, and I'm really excited. You really inspired me. I've been listening to your music next to Run DMC and NWA, and I'm like, wow, there's this weird sort of synergy. And I wanted to mention that to you, that it really inspired me. Again, I really appreciate all your time. It's been really wonderful, and thank you. Again,
no worries.
Thanks. All right, now, enjoy your
Cheers.
evening.
Enjoy the rest of your day, Richard. Really good to speak to you.
You too.
Take care.
Yeah. My name is Richard Smith, and I'm your host. I'm a filmmaker, an art director, and once upon a time I was part of the big 80s. I designed record covers for Depeche Mode, I danced with Bono, discussed art with Mick Jagger, and drank tea with Susie Sue. I also grew up during those turbulent times in England in the late 70s and was driven by the do-it-yourself ethos of punk. I obsessed over bands like Joy Division and New Order, and went on to work for the album cover designer Peter Saville. I believe that year, that moment in 1976, when a bunch of foul-mouthed yobs cursed and swore on national television, changed the future of culture forever, and is what brought us to where we are today. So where do we go from here? Will emerging new technologies be the catalyst that tears down the walls of mediocrity, throwing culture and society into chaos and revolution again? We'll have to wait and see. This has been another episode of Destroy. Thank you for listening. Destroy is a Be Right Back Studios production. Learn more at BeRightBackStudios.com. And please tune in again for another episode of Destroy, the Influence of Punk podcast, wherever you listen or download.